Welcome to Shelf Talkers, a podcast from Village Well Books and Coffee in downtown Culver City. Welcome back to Shelf Talkers. We're so excited for the episode this week with the Cyberpunk anthology editor, Jared Shurin. We'll get into that in a second, but Julia, how are you today? I'm so glad to be here.
Shout out to Jared. He works on Saturdays, the busiest days.
A lot of times, yeah, a lot of times.
But it was, as of recording last Saturday, we got a big recognition, Village Well Books and Coffee.
Cool. Yeah, it was our California State Assembly member, so the California State government, the assembly member that represents Culver City and kind of the surrounding areas, a guy named Isaac Bryan. He was in the store doing a bit of a meet and greet, a little, kissing babies, shaking hands, hour and a half, talking to constituents. And then he apparently is, a fan of Village Well Books and Coffee. And he brought a beautiful framed document that is an official notice that the state of California recognizes specifically the community building that Village Well Books and Coffee provides to our community. And it was a really, really cool moment.
I mean, this beautiful framed acknowledgement is in text from the 1800s, and it's
it was all thous and heretofores and hence wits, and it was as official as it could be.
on the busiest day of the week. Great day for constituents.
Great day for constituents to be walking through. I mean, I don't know if you saw in downtown Culver City was also a car show. Yeah. So most of the streets were blocked off. I mean, that was a day. Yeah. Village Well had 3 events that day. We had the women's only pop-up market, right. And we also had, I believe, a poetry reading that evening. So it was quite the Saturday. I wasn't here the whole time, but.
And that's why, so for folks that come into the store and ask people at the register, including myself and Jared,
do you have an event tonight?
Is there an event tonight? Well, a lot of times we don't know because there is actually so much going on at the store.
Almost always the answer is yes.
Exactly.
We just don't always know what that is unless we've been studying up for the pop quiz.
Right.
Which is
it does feel
feels
like a pop
that.
Quiz.
And I love it. We have all the information at the register, obviously, but that was a really fun day, though. I mean, Isaac Bryan was really cool. He said hi to so many people. He made the announcement to the whole store that we were getting this document. So that was a fun time.
That's cool.
Well, and Julia, this upcoming episode that we're releasing, this interview with Jared Shurin, an anthology Cyberpunk editor. You mentioned in the interview, which we'll get to in a second, but you mentioned that you are a cyborg, and you are our main sound mixer for this podcast, and I'm very thankful for that, because to me, I think a lot of the editing is a necessary evil to present art to the world, but you seem to enjoy that part of the process, and yet you're also hard of hearing and our sound mixer. And so with that cyborg element.
So I've been a cyborg since the age of 11 when I first got my hearing aids. I think this is in the interview, but I am a full-on cyborg, and I definitely identify. It is, but one thing I've learned, I've studied sound design. I've been doing sound editing for some time. At USC, my mentor was Stephen Flick, did RoboCop, it's a good cyberpunk reference, and won an Academy Award for Speed, I think the movie is. And he said to me once, he's like, "You're a perfect person for sound design because you physically have to listen more." And so then in that way, we are in our own punk way challenging what we consider to be what a sound designer is, or what does a sound designer need to do their job effectively.
Sure.
I can be deaf, and I can, what is normal? No, but this was a really fun interview because of all of the identity that I feel like I'm a part of with the cyberpunk thing. So thanks for bringing that up.
You can't hear their phone number that they give.
Yeah. And so, that kind of thing too is like challenging how we expect other people to be listening. It's like, oh, that's something I think it is a very cyberpunk outlook, or very cyberpunk.
Very punk.
Yeah, very punk inquest. A punk inquest is to challenge the way we think about people listening to ourselves.
Cool. I love that. Thank you for sharing your experience on that.
Yeah, man. Thanks for listening, guys, to me talking about listening.
We love listening to you, Julia. We are here today, though, to present this interview with Jared Shurin. Now, Jared Shurin is the editor of the Big Book of Cyberpunk, which came out last year, a cyberpunk anthology. It's a massive tome that came out. He has been an anthology editor over the years for multiple different books, and he currently resides in London. We were blessed to have him on the podcast to talk about this newest release. In this episode, we talk about how his name is also Jared and how that's the best name that's ever existed. We talk about his journey as a writer slash anthologist. We talk about how in his early career he ran a small press and the challenges that came with that. We talk about the trendiness right now and the cultural moment of what it means to be cyberpunk and how Julia is kind of a cyborg like we just talked about. And we end talking about the difference between sci-fi and cyberpunk and the moral responsibility of those genres. Guys, you're going to enjoy this. Thank you, villagers, for listening. This is Shelf Talkers. Welcome back to Shelf Talkers. I am, of course, here with my co-host and co-bookseller, Julia. How you doing today?
Hey, it's so great to be here. It's going to be a fun ride.
We might even say on a cyber bike. Okay, here we go. That was fluid. Welcome, Jared, to the podcast. Great name, by the way.
It's brilliant, isn't it? We were remarking earlier, it's very rare to have two Jareds in one room.
I mean, and can you imagine how cool and smart our parents feel in this moment?
I think it's
a privilege. I feel privileged to be in a room with two Jareds.
I mean, the challenge is that, present company excluded, most Jareds are terrible people.
You're not wrong. The two most famous Jareds?
Terrible people.
Terrible people. We were not even going to say them on this.
The question is, who is the better Jared between the two?
This just became very gladiatorial.
Very competitive. Hopefully we can reach the upper echelons of the Jareds in the world. You as an anthology editor, me as a professional talker. Julia, do you want to kick us off for our opening question?
Yeah, so our opening question is the question we ask all of our guests. Would you be willing to write a shelf talker for your book, The Big Book of Cyberpunk?
I would love to write a shelf talker for The Big Book of Cyberpunk. There's nothing more of a privilege than walking into a bookstore and seeing that you have earned an actual shelf talker. So getting to write my own is very difficult. And I'm going to keep stalling while I think of it. But it'd be something along the lines of the massive collection of super relevant stories, thinking about how we relate to technology in fun ways. It's sort of a word soup, but you know what? That's what an anthology is. It's a soup.
You might even say that's what books are. Is a nice word soup. Okay. You're from Kansas City, right? Midwest, fellow Midwesterner. You currently live in London. What has your journey been in your career that has kind of brought you to London, and then finally ending with this big book of cyberpunk?
I think it's more of a journey without a career that brought me, like many people, to books. When I graduated from university, I had a lot of enthusiasm and no effort put into actually applying for jobs. But one of my best friends had a job in London. It was 2002. Why not? I mean, when someone says, I've got a sofa, when you're 21 or whatever, you take the sofa.
I still live on couches sometimes. Yeah.
Immensely comfortable. I think I've actually hit the point in my life where actually the couch is more comfortable than the bed again,
love that.
So in this case, the couch was in London. I went there, I settled in with my friends, I wound up finding work, finding a life there, and never actually returning.
Oh, wow.
And then maybe 15 years ago, I was between jobs, and my wife and I are both people that just fill voids of empty space. Conversationally, in a kitchen, whatever, if there's empty space, we will figure out a way to just fill it with some sort of clutter. And in this case, the empty space was, what are we doing all day? And what we chose to do was actually set up a small press. And like many other people, I think, that enter the publishing space, we thought we had all the answers and that we would be absolutely fantastic. And we were definitely people that started a small press.
And all the trials and tribulations are baked in.
It was absolutely spectacular. The list of phenomenal mistakes we made, if you can forgive the digression. The first book we did, we actually managed to convince the Tate Britain, the gallery, that they needed an anthology to go with an upcoming exhibition on the paintings of John Martin. And we're like, guys, the apocalypse is super hot right now. What you need is like a book of fiction to go with it. And they said, sure, if you can get us a few hundred copies of that, we'll sell it through the stores. So we whipped that together in about 3 months.
Wow.
And
whipped together from finding the stories all the way through physically producing these things? Wow.
We did. One of the things that we wanted to do is that we knew our book was going to be like classy because it was going into Tate Britain. It was going to be sold in, a gallery gift shop. It had to be the best. And in our minds, our very untrained minds, the best meant the best quality paper. And obviously the best quality paper meant like the thickest, heaviest paper you could get, right? So these books weighed so much. You couldn't carry a box of 20 of them. It was just pressed sheets of steel for each page. And now they've collapsed. Like the spine can't actually hold that book together.
Because when it's open, it just weighs on the spine too much?
It just snaps out. I mean, even on the shelf, it will just start crumbling if it doesn't go there.
I love the tangibility of that trial,
example,
that
yeah.
mistake.
We were so excited. And, we lost a fortune on shipping because you just couldn't ship them like ordinary things. You had to have like a cart of horses to hold them.
Wells Fargo cart coming through.
Anyway, that was the first of many books that we put out together, all of which collapsed and, were also works of art in some way or another. My wife is a spectacular editorial talent and was immediately snapped up by one of the big fives. And I continued it on my own for a few years, sort of a dilettante anthologist ever since. So I take on maybe one project a year or every couple of years. I'm very lucky to get to pick and choose in that way. And that led to, a few years ago, the big book of Cyberpunk turned out to be the big idea that captured my attention and, very fortunately, the nice people at Vintage as well.
Yeah, was that a project that you pitched to them of I have enough stories in mind that I want to coalesce, or how did that pitch go?
It was. The pitch went, like many other pitches, I had put together about 10 really well-considered ideas that all had like 50 pages behind them and tons of research. And then one year over the holidays, I think they were announcing, like Fortnite had said that they were doing a Cyberpunk
Season or whatever, yeah.
And I'm like, okay, this is ridiculous. Like, you can connect the dots. There's like, they're talking about a new Matrix. They're talking about Fortnite. They're talking about all of these things. Like, Cyberpunk is everywhere. Someone should just do like a damn Cyberpunk anthology. And I mean, that was my email to my agent. And he's like, great. And then, 3 days after Christmas, he's like, could you do this, for Vintage, but it has to be really, really, really big. Like, they're looking for the next big book.
Wow.
Like, yes.
You're like, I can even do that and put it in the title.
Yeah. I think there's an idea here.
Yeah.
How about the working title is something about bigness, something about
Something about how big it is.
Can I ask, when were you first connecting those dots? Like, was it 2022, 2023?
Oh, it would have been earlier than that. About 20. I am really bad at time.
That's fair.
I'm half decent at space, but time is a social.
You're good at
I think Matrix came out like May of 22, I think. or something.
I asked because last Halloween, not this 2023, but 2022 Halloween, I was Lucy from Cyberpunk. It was a Netflix animated show, and
Yes.
I hand-stitched the costume because the costume was sold out internationally.
Wow.
So that was I'm very proud of my cosplay there, but
Well
that
done.
you were right on the mark there as far as
A pop culture moment.
And it still is. I'm very pleased, selfishly, I suppose, if not societally, that Cyberpunk is still really, really hot right now. Like that, it's a word we all use. It's a trend we all spot. It's an aesthetic that we're all sort of living in. It's a bit of a reference point, which I'm really pleased. I say long may it last, but obviously it's like, yay, we're living in a cyberpunk present, but also,
Cyberpunk is ever present.
Yes, thank you. We're done here.
Well, so I think of cyberpunk, it's very personal to me, as more than a genre. For me, it is an identity. I am an augmented human. Since I was 10, I've worn hearing aids, wearable tech. And so thus, I am a cyborg. And I used to call my hearing aid pouch the cyberpunk pouch, as in my little thing that I carry my hearing aids in if they're not working. And in that vein, I'm very drawn to your anthology, the big book of cyberpunk, and then everything else that goes with it. What about cyberpunk are you drawn to?
That's a fantastic question, because it's not normally seen as like a happy genre. And it's wonderful that your relationship with it is actually positive, and that you're living a technologically enhanced life, and that is what cyberpunk is about. It's about a relationship with technology. My story goes back to was probably like 16 or 17, and I managed to convince my high school English teacher to let me do my thesis. High school thesis is what, like 2,000 words, but it was obviously the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life to date. But she let me write it about Neuromancer.
Which is kind of the seminal cyberpunk work of culture. Yeah.
And it's William Gibson's phenomenal novel that just set out the terms and conditions of the genre. I mean, I was 16. I didn't know any of that. I'm like, ooh, it's got like babes with razor claws, and then you like go into the internet. That's really neat. But in, doing this first ever, it was the first research piece I'd ever done at the time. So not just about Neuromancer, but learning about Gibson and everything that he'd written and actually digging into some of his nonfiction and his essays. And he wrote a really powerful piece following the LA riots, where he talked about watching people on television, rioters, people that were going through a huge amount of, almost like a mini revolution in a way. And he saw people passing by computer stores and sort of looting shoe stores or other sorts of electronic stores. And he wrote about screaming at the television, saying, no, go back. Like, that's the thing that will free you. That's what you need. Grab those. And that always stuck with me as sort of a slightly science fictional way of saying teach a man to fish or whatever. But there's something really interesting about that relationship with technology, that some people have the access and the privilege to it, and it is a revolutionary tool, and it's a terrifying thing, and it can free you, and it can, all of those things that it can do. And Gibson wrote about that really well. And when I was 17, wow, trying to piece all of that together.
So you're saying that he was saying that, it sounds like you're kind of getting even at the way the world is crumbling, like the punk and cyberpunk. Can you explain kind of the relationship of that word and how it's played? I mean, we have other genres like steampunk, and then nowadays you even hear people talk about solar punk and other things. So what's the punk and cyberpunk? It sounds like that's kind of what you're hinting at with the world is crumbling. How are we going to change the world? What does it look like to actually change the world through technology, through art, and then cyberpunk? I mean, punk rock, all these things, right?
I don't think the world likes to be changed. And I think the punk aspect of it is the fact that you need to add an element of challenge to whatever you do. That there is going to be there's going to be conflict at whatever level you want to look at that. And I think it's a little reductive to just look at it as like a formula of, how to use those two words over and over again. But cyberpunk is, it's about technology and challenge and how those two things come together. And often, is the technology causing the challenge? Do you need to challenge the technology? Is the technology the thing that aids your challenge? Is it, what are you doing with that? But those two elements are really at the core of the genre.
In your editor's note, you write, if it is the essence of cyberpunk to understand that one can simultaneously challenge and deserve to be challenged. Can you talk more about what does that mean to be deserved to be challenged?
First, I just love that someone actually read the editor's note. That's amazing. So cyberpunk is interesting in a lot of ways. And, there's lots of things that drew me to it. And one of the things that I found most admirable about the genre is that, or the movement, we can talk about cyberpunk however we like, but the mode, I think, is a particular pretentious word that I use about 5 times. But cyberpunk has always been reflexive, and actually self-reflective as well. From its beginning, cyberpunk began just as much as a postmodern tradition as a science fictional one. It was a way of examining other literary movements at the time and what the literary status was and how you wrote, who you wrote for, even the means of publication. But it was never meant to be finished, I suppose. It's inherently challenging. And so when the cyberpunk idea came out there, those first stories came out, there was immediately a second wave challenging the first wave. There was immediately a third wave challenging the second wave. And it kept on going and going and going. And you get that on its simplest level. You find stories that are referring to one another over the years and over the decades. You get people responding to the same ideas and writing in the same space, deliberately revisiting those. But you also get stories correcting one another or re-challenging them or fixing them. And, that first wave of cyberpunk creators was very demographically similar. They were all North American. They were all white. They were all straight. They were all male. And that, again, what I don't mean to do is sort of elide all of the incredible first wave cyberpunks that were not. But when you talk about people like Gibson and Sterling and Shirley and, all of the names that come from that sort of core cyberpunk period, they are all very demographically alike. And that's not to minimize their talent or what they brought or the challenges that they saw that are true challenges for many, many, many people. But it immediately prompted, rightfully, a response from, Candace Jane Dorsey's story, Writing About Machine Sex, is a response to that first wave of cyberpunk and the creators of it. And it's a phenomenal story that's in the big book of cyberpunk, and one of the ones I recommend most because I think it sheds a lot of light on everything that happened before and after, and how the genre changes over time. The big book of cyberpunk is divided into a few different sort of thematic sections, and what it does is explore each of those themes over time. But each one of them also starts with a precursor story that's not a cyberpunk story, but actually introduces some of the themes that we then later see in that core cyberpunk period, and then all the way through to contemporary short fiction.
I have two questions. One, first off, is what sort of trepidations, if you had any, about creating the big book of cyberpunk when the ethos of cyberpunk is anti-establishment, right? An anthology is a canon of a genre, and in cyberpunk is inherently, essentially anti-establishment.
I love that, and I love that you appreciate that, because it's a mad genre, and you get people come to it from all sorts of angles. There's a whole school of people out there. I've already seen it in the reviews that are like, well, you can't have a big book of cyberpunk because cyberpunk only existed for 3 years in a particular North American context, and everything else is just sparkling dystopia. That sort of thing. Whereas my definition is deliberately sprawling and nebulous and hopefully invitational. The goal is that I do think it's a genre that, as you said, is still going, that is everywhere, that is continuous. And it's about our relationship with technology, and that's not going away.
If anything, we are in a period of increasing that conversation. I mean, the news resembles cyberpunk conversations more than ever.
Absolutely right. I just saw something earlier today where a charity, with permission, was using AI to reconstruct messages from the victims of mass shootings. It's an incredibly powerful piece of communications, and they went about it sensitively, the ethics of AI being what they are, but at least
right.
they were trying to do the right thing. Like, that's actually a story in here,
From how long ago? Or like just curious, like how much that kind of prophetic predictive voice, had.
It's a really good question. I'm going to fail that quiz, but let's say within the last decade.
You got what, 1,000 stories in there?
But it's there's a story in here about using AI to reconstruct a grieving parent reconstructs the victim of a mass shooting, and what then the fallout of that is. It's please pause while I pretend that I know what's in my own book. It's Ted Lieu.
Oh, yeah. I know Ted. I don't know Ted, but I know his work. I've read Paper Menagerie. That's Ted Lieu, right?
Yeah, Ken Lieu. Sorry, it's Ken Lieu.
Yeah, Ken Lieu. Yeah, Ken Lieu.
And that story is Ken Lieu's Thoughts and Prayers. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant and heartbreaking. And what he does with, again, being quite prophetic, he actually talks about, the backlash against it and the people that call it disinformation and the trolls that come out of the woodwork and all of the sort of layers on layers on layers of social response to it. But again, that's cyberpunk, talking about our relationship with technology, actually, and being quite prophetic about it.
Pretty wild how predictive on the nose that is.
I really am invested in this genre, not just as somebody that is a cyborg, but also as a writer. And I have felt that. I've felt that, like, tapped into that prophetic feeling. But I, honestly, as somebody that's still learning about everything all the time, cyberpunk just within the whole big sweeping genre of science fiction, like, how do you separate science fiction from cyberpunk, or do you?
That is a fantastic question. And you kind of can. I did such a dance to try and not define cyberpunk. It was an amazing sort of like tango, and eventually my editor's like, you are going to have to do that. You can't actually do, a million words of cyberpunk stories without actually defining cyberpunk at some point.
As a cyberpunk fan, I enjoyed the definitions, but that just might be my own.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad it meets someone's
personality.
There's lots of levels. I mean, I have lots of hard rules in here on how I chose stories that were going to be cyberpunk and not something else. even if they do overlap with something else, science fiction, Afrofuturism, postmodernism, all of those things where cyberpunk sort of brushes against them. To me, though, a vibes check that really annoys a lot of people. But science fiction to me is really, really about the what and the how. It's really excited about creating faster than light, or thinking about colonies on the moon, or thinking about all of those things and how they come about. And that's brilliant. Like, we need that. It's also predictive. It's also really important. It's instructional. It leads to lots of things. Cyberpunk does not care about the how. Neuromancer, or, returning to Neuromancer is sort of a nice defining moment that everyone can agree that is Cyberpunk. Neuromancer is just full of absolute bollocks. Like, the actual technology in it is just like, it's hand wavy, it's magical. I mean, there is actual magic in Neuromancer. No one ever really talks about it, but there's bits where he's talking to God's in fact. I mean, it's just completely mad. It doesn't care about how tech works.
It just cares about the ethical questions that we get to when the tech exists.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
It cares about how we relate to it. It's all about humans. It's completely human-centric rather than tech-centric. And the only purpose of technology is how it affects our lives. What are the repercussions to us? We don't care about how it works. We don't care about how it got there. We don't care about the thing itself. It's, phenomenological science fiction. Like, we care about what it affects, how it affects the space around it, that space being us.
And how it affects our experience of reality and our experience of relationships without having to figure out what was the microchip that, brought them to this point.
That's exactly right. It's not about the...
This is just interesting. It's like getting into the philosophical nature of genres and what are they. I'm so impressed with the fact that I think good science fiction too is, at the end of the day, not really concerned with that. Like, if you're over concerned with the science, then you're missing the human element of it. And I think that is
in good sci-fi.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And I think...
Like, doesn't want Space Odyssey, not concerned.
No, I mean, that's, your...
Interstellar, overly concerned.
And I do think there are sort of...
Hot take.
Yeah.
There are, and that's where my sort of checklist almost comes from. But, like, if it's going to be entirely about tech's relationship to humans, there has to be rules around that. So actually, when you start having inexplicable monoliths from space, when you're talking about space travel, when it's too irrelevant to existing human lives, even if you are then later at the end of that journey talking about humans, to me, that's not cyberpunk. Like, it has to still be grounded in the present or the future or a foreseeable future. Like, it shouldn't make you be thinking about the gaps. It should just be thinking about
where it is,
what it means to you.
I mean, it sounds like, not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you're also kind of implying that in order for it to be cyberpunk, it has to ask an ethical question.
I think it does go back to technology, though. It goes back to the human relationship with technology. I mean, I know a lot about movies and TV, and thinking about Battlestar Galactica, that, that is science fiction, because they're not thinking about why are we on the spaceship, or, they're out thinking, they're thinking about, are these cyborgs human or not, but actually it could be cyberpunk because of the Cylons. But that's all to say, I think it is a question of technology and humans' relationship to technology.
So I think the ethics part is a really good way of looking at it. And in that context, I'm defining ethics as how humans behave with one another. And I think that's where...
and how we should, and where the boundaries of that are.
Exactly. And I think, when we're talking about how technology affects human behavior, it's inherently ethical, because you are then posing, what is this going to change about how we relate to one another and how we relate to ourselves, and everything from identity to community. That's
whereas maybe science fiction could be more existential, perhaps.
Yeah, or just adventurous.
Yeah.
Into worlds unknown, frontiers and all that.
I do think, great science fiction. I mean, the Mary Doria Russell's The Sparrow is space opera that is entirely about ethics. Becky Chambers.
Totally, not usually exclusive by any means. Yeah.
But is there cyberpunk space opera is a fascinating question, and you probably are going to wind
up. Is there one that you can think of? I'm just trying to think through. Yeah, what would that look like?
I am. I'm an Alien 3 truther.
Okay.
But I would say if there is going to be some sort of cyberpunk space opera, it would be probably Alien 1 or 3.
Okay.
I mean, you've got and again, that's such we are weaseling this in on like 53 different technicalities.
Right.
Like, it's a ship. It's got aliens. It's not cyberpunk because it's got aliens, it's in space, it's in a like not immediately discernible future, like all of that crap that removes it from being cyberpunk. But it's also, it's about blue collar workers, it's about financial problems, it's about overbearing corporations, it's very much about ethics, it's about family units, it's about found families, it's about created families, it's about all sorts of things. And if you think about the alien itself as a type of technology that's at the center of that people are competing for it and people are fighting for it, and then it's also, brutally affecting people's lives while the corporation's trying to take it at the expense of the ordinary. I mean, I think there's all sorts of, you could probably say that's at the center of a very, very, very spurious Venn diagram.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like you're saying, the categories are never rigid or complete, but always overlap in some way. So yeah, but as the expert of the big book, I think you've got the most valid opinion of all of us here.
Oh, I'll take that.
I'll take. I think
yeah. I mean, categories exist for shelf talkers, don't they? Like they exist so you can, the sort of vibe that you're looking for, and it helps you pick up the book, and everything you do once you pick it up is up to you.
Yeah, we kind of need categories just to know, I think I might like that, because it's like this other thing that is also in that category, even if at the end of the day, every book is a category of one. Hopefully every piece of art is a category of one if we're really going to, be existential about it. I think that's beautiful. I think that, one question that I love about this is like sci-fi or fantasy in general, but definitely I think cyberpunk as like a subsection of that. When I hear people talk about the difference between like Lucas and Roddenberry, or which obviously neither of those I would call of Star Trek or Star Wars necessarily cyberpunk, but sci-fi adjacent enough in the category of people often talk about how like Star Wars is a little bit more of an optimistic future. Sorry, is a more of a pessimistic future, and more of a like this is what happens when fascism takes over the world or the empire. And Star Trek is more of a like here's what technology is going to do to improve the human federation and all of these things. This is how technology is actually going to improve us. And it's a very optimistic look at the future of technology and how it's going to push everything. Do you think that the genre has like an inherent a responsibility to be more in one camp or the other?
Well, it's certainly not my role as an anthologist to tell authors the sorts of stories they should write.
Of course.
Just the ones that I like.
Which is a great disclaimer.
Yes, thank you. There's no straight answer to that. So I'm going to go back to a point we had actually mentioned earlier, which is cyberpunk dystopian? Because I think what you're asking, if there's a moral responsibility there, like if you can see or predict the future, should you then be, warning people against it or leading it in a certain way? And certainly that's something the cyberpunks faced in a way. They're writing about a path that they can see ahead of them and where technology is leading people. So should they be painting an optimistic picture or a pessimistic one, or just putting up a lot of warning signs on the road? And I don't think cyberpunk is inherently dystopian. People use the two words a lot together. The point of dystopia is that a dystopia is a fixed thing. When you have entered a dystopia, you're there. Like a utopia, it's a final state. It's a teleological approach. When you hit dystopia, you hit the bottom, you're done. And cyberpunk refuses to acknowledge that kind of stasis. And
that's a beautiful distinction.
That was so helpful. I want everybody to listen to this episode.
But I think there's no cyberpunk world that is fixed. Like even if things are going quite badly, there's always that element of hope or challenge to it. And even if things are going quite well, what cyberpunk is then doing is saying, well, actually, this is built on the back of something quite bad, and you need to be considering it more and more. So cyberpunk is about that that challenge, that constant need for a reflection and to prompt things further and further and further along.
That's beautiful. I think that's the best way to even describe cyberpunk. And I think as we move into our final question, I think just for time, this has been such a fun conversation. I can't believe it's already been over a half hour. That's kind of a mind-blowing idea. What is the number of stories in the big book?
There's 108 stories.
So there's 108 stories in the big book. So anybody listening can go and check out 108 different stories that touch on the different things we've talked about. Dystopia, is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic? Is it punk? Is it anti-establishment? For works that are not already in the big book, what would be a few books that you would write a shelf talker for? AKA, too, if you liked the conversation, what other books should you check out?
Oh, that's such a mean question. So just to reiterate what you said, if you like the big book of Cyberpunk, or even if you don't, like,
Or you just like the interview even, you know?
even if you like the interview, if you like the interview, buy the book. But if
Yeah,
you
that's
don't
the
like
number
interview-
one for
yeah.
sure. Link in bio.
Come through the village well.
If you don't like it, buy it just so you can disagree with me online. I'm great with that too. All right, 3 works.
I love watching the gears turn in your mind.
This is
Of
tough.
like, I can tell you started with like 10 and you're whittling it down. And you're like, I can see you like scratching off the walls of your mind of like, not that one. I love it.
So the first, and this will be the only overlap. But the final story in here is by an author named Bohini Vara. She actually won the Pulitzer Prize after Height, which is probably why I could afford to get her in the anthology. But she's absolutely brilliant. The story in here is one called Ghosts. To me, the perfect encapsulation of where cyberpunk is now, and I think she's a absolutely phenomenal author. And she, Kinivara, had a book out last year called The Immortal King Rao, which is started cyberpunk now and not in 1983. It'd be with a book like The Immortal King Rao.
You think it's that beautiful, that good, that it would launch the movement.
It would launch the movement, and the way that it just discusses, our relationship with technology and projecting it forward, but from a point of view of someone in 2023 as opposed to someone surrounded by the trappings of 1983. So I think it's a really powerful book from an absolutely phenomenal author. 2 others. Claire North is a fantastic British author. She wrote a standalone novella called Sweet Harmony, which is just about one of the bleakest things you could possibly imagine reading. And it's projecting based on our relationship with subscription services. So
Love that.
imagine if
Every day I'm going and I'm deleting and unsubscribing and figuring out how to unsubscribe and not.
Yeah, figuring
not
out how many
unsubscribe.
buttons I can hit before
How
I
many
finally.
how many calls I have to make. A lot of times you have to call.
I love that. So there's a whole book about that.
it's about, what if, your skin, you could have healthy skin as a subscription service, or what if you could improve your eyesight as a microtransaction? What if that sort of the body modifications we were talking about earlier, what if that became, corporate owned microtransactions and subscription services, and what's the social pressure going to be off the back of that? What's the financial pressure going to be off the back of that? And it's absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely horrifying.
Say the name again.
So it's Claire North is the author, and the book is called Sweet Harmony. It is digital only.
Okay.
But well worth finding and well worth tracking down. And then the third, Pat Murphy is a legendary science fiction author. She's absolutely brilliant, award-winning up and down the line. She wrote a story, again, we're looking at about 30 years ago, called Desert Rain. The shelf talker would be it's about a woman that falls in love with her household AI. And it is absolutely beautiful. And very, very, very smart. And you read articles now about people that are creating these curated virtual relationships with AI
Yeah, it's
girlfriends
happening.
and boyfriends.
It's happening.
She was, again, way ahead of the curve. And you talk about ethics and almost the etiquette that comes off of that. Like, how do we treat increasingly humanized technology? And this story, Desert Rain, was way ahead of the curve, and sort of what we demand from this technology, and then what good or ill it brings out in us in the way that we treat them, and how those relationships can become very powerful or very toxic. And it's very, very, very smart, and it's very, very lovely, and I highly recommend it.
Love that. Those have been some great recommendations. Julia, any final thoughts before we call this thing done?
No, that was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, Jared. Any parting words?
No, thank you so much for having me. One of the best bookstores in the world, and so it's a real honor to be here.
Wow, that's beautiful, especially because he is truly an international person, so that actually means something. Because if I said this is the best bookstore in the world, it's like this or Indiana. I think that you have done a good job representing the Jareds.
I appreciate that in the spirit of Cyberpunk, this episode started with a challenge between the two of y'all.
And
Also
it ends
in
with
this-
a handshake.
It ends with a handshake.
Well, thank you so much, Jared Shurin, for being here. Everybody, check out the big book of Cyberpunk. You can buy it from the Village Well website. You can buy it in shop.
All right. Hey, guys. Thanks so much for sticking around. This is Culver New Came, where we talk a little bit about our events, and more namely, we have a book recommendation. Today, we have a community member. His name is Art Nomura. Art, please introduce yourself. How do you part of Village Well Books and Coffee community?
Well, this corner has been a bit cursed where this bookstore is currently located, and many businesses came and went. And then, thankfully, Village Well showed up and kind of rescued the whole. I tried to patronize the place as much as possible because I thought it was a great addition to the neighborhood.
Yeah. When I first started working here back in August, that was the very first story I heard is this was the cursed corner. And now, this is quite the opposite. Jen Casper, the owner of Village Well, has turned it right around. I mean, we're going to be having an expansion here in June, which a lot of customers have been asking about. I think we're going to learn more about that in the coming weeks. But Art, what book do you recommend to people in the Village Well community?
Well, I mean, the book I wrote, Musical True Spirit, is something that was near and dear to my heart for many, many years. I must have started on it, probably 11 years ago. And it came out in various forms. And I finally got the book published. And then Jen was kind enough to host an event here where I spoke about it. But May is Asian American Pacific Islander Month, and I thought, this is a good time. So here I am.
Yeah, so it's Musical True Spirit. It's a biography about your grandmother, and what inspired you initially to tell the story?
Well, I'm a filmmaker, and I grew up with a lot of filmmakers as contemporaries, and many of them were Asian American, and they made the requisite movie about their grandparents. And I thought, after viewing a number of them, those are nice, but boy, those people are boring. And compared to my grandmother, anyway, and I thought I should do one on my grandmother. So that was the inspiration.
It's funny. Well, this past year, the best short documentary nominees is Nai Nai, which is a documentary about two Chinese American grandmothers. So yeah, you're right. And then my partner is Indian American, and the first script he ever wrote was about his grandmother. Something about grandmothers.
Well, they are very powerful, either through force of personality or just the fact that they hold so much sway over the family, even though most Asian cultures seem to be patriarchal. But I mean, who's the power behind the throne, really? Right.
My own grandmother is Italian, and my father, really identifies with that. And so my mom reckons with it. There's the head of the family, and then there's the neck, and so she can turn the head the way she wants to.
That's great.
But yeah, so tell us about the story of your grandmother.
Well, I didn't know much of the details, although my grandmother was a tremendous storyteller in her own right. And she didn't speak much English, and my Japanese used to be much better when I was little, so I could understand most of what she said. So I heard stories that I thought they were hard to believe, because some of the things she did, like dressing up as a man to work on the railroad, and
wow,
and being a teamster, pulling out stumps of fallen trees. This is not women's work, and she did a lot of other things that would be considered more female, like being a laundress and a seamstress and a cook and et cetera, but she lived a very hard life. Birthing 5 of her 6 kids by herself and doing all kinds of remarkable things.
Wait, so what years was your grandmother kicking around?
She was born in 1895 outside of Hiroshima, Japan, to a very wealthy family. And her father experienced a tremendous downturn in fortune because his wife had incurred a huge debt that he felt honor bound to repay. And that basically decimated their fortune, which they had held for hundreds of years. My grandmother literally went from riches to rags because of that. But, the thing about my grandmother that was really captivating to me is that she was the first one that gave me a real hug. In Asian culture, especially in Japanese culture, people are not physically demonstrative. And she was a person that would hug me, really hug me in the full body, and she laughed so openly. And this was really alien to me in my upbringing. Although I love my parents, they never did that kind of thing with me.
Oh, that was really wonderful. So that's Mizuko True Spirit by Art Nomura. Is there anything else you want to talk about with the community?
I've taken on this role of being a bicycle advocate, and those of you who live locally have probably seen me riding around on my bike.
Having you come into the store and then now just getting to sit and talk with you is just such an honor and pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So this podcast is coming out on Wednesday, May 22nd. And on the following Friday, we have a memoir launch with Jane Wong. Her debut memoir, it's called Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City, with award-winning author Jean Chen Ho. So that is going to be a very popular evening. And before that, we also have numerous book launches at the end of May. So everybody, we also have on Wednesday tonight, we have our Super Sets comedy. Make sure to get tickets for that because they do sell out, and you can go again online to get your tickets and to see all the events that we have at Village Well Books and Coffee. Thanks so much, guys. See you in 2 weeks.
Looking for links to the books mentioned in this episode of Shelf Talkers? Looking for ways to connect with this week's guest? Maybe you want to reach out to us about thoughts or questions for the podcast. For all of that, check out the show notes beneath the episode. You can also order your books online through villagewell.com. This episode of Shelf Talkers is brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee. It was produced, edited, and hosted by Julia Elizabeth Evans and Jared Cassabum, and our theme music is from Noah Vickland. See you in 2 weeks, and keep reading.